my plan basically is to walk you through every section of a Cochrane protocol and just outline what I and other members of my team have seen in these sections that we consider, first of all, the good things, the good practice examples that we would like to see, and then also the errors that we see far too often and would really like either authors to try and avoid doing, or if you're an editor, helping you to spot those errors and correct them now at the protocol stage, rather than letting them linger and then have a much bigger, more negative impact during the review stage. I would start by saying, I think one of the most common errors that people make when it comes to writing Cochrane review protocols is not making maximum use of the available resources. Now, at the moment, most of the resources that you need to write a protocol are all available for you here online in one place on the Cochrane Training website, which is just here, training.cochrane.org/handbooks. And in this one page, you have so much resource, so much help available to you. You have the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews and Interventions. You have the Standards for Conduct and Reporting of New Intervention Reviews, which people might know as Messier standards. There's also the Style Manual, the Grade Handbook for doing your grade assessments, the Information Specialist Handbooks for planning your search, and even a handbook for if you're doing a diagnostic test accuracy review. So everything I'm about to talk about today can probably be found in one of these resources. And the example I'm going to talk through today is a standard pairwise meta-analysis review. But even if you are doing a different type of review, the majority of what I'm talking about can be applied to pretty much any type of review. So like I say, we're just going to take each section of the protocol in turn. If you have done a Cochrane review before, or if you've just started, you'll probably recognize this page. This is when you first open your Cochrane review, your Cochrane protocol, you go onto RevMan Web and you have all of the sections here that now have to be populated. And every section must be populated. People are always tempted to try and deactivate sections or remove sections that they think aren't relevant to them. I guarantee you every one of these sections is relevant to your review. So you need to think very carefully about each one and make sure you're putting the appropriate information in and that you've really thought through every decision that you are about to make during the full review process. So we'll start then with the first one, the background section. So the background is essential to succinctly justify all your subsequent sections of the review. I mean, in a Cochrane review, some people tend to gloss over the background, thinking it's just a precursor to the main event, which is the methods and the results. But in fact, the background is really essential because it's here that you explain and justify why you're about to do everything that you're doing. Not just why you're answering this review question, but also what exactly are the eligibility criteria that you're interested in? What are the most important comparisons that we need answers to? What are the most important outcomes of interest that really will tell us about the effectiveness of this intervention? What are the potential effect modifiers that could impact the results that will be explored via subgroup analyses? And also, how would you prioritize the evidence, the comparisons and the outcomes into the most important comparisons and outcomes for clinical decision makers? And it's these prioritized comparisons and outcomes that you'll present in the summary of findings tables. So all of the decisions that you make for these subsequent sections should be tied back to something that you've mentioned in the background section. So if you're doing a subgroup analysis on the different types of age and the effect that the intervention has on adults versus children, you should have something in your background section explaining why there might actually be a difference between adults and children. Or if you're only interested in 2 or 3 outcomes in the review, the background section should explain why those 3 outcomes are the most important to focus on. So don't gloss over this section. Don't think it's just an easy literature review. It's really, really important to make sure that it's concise, but it's clear about why you're doing this review question and why you have made all these subsequent decisions. And in terms of the most common error we see in the background section, I would say it would most frequently happen in this subsection of the background, the why it's important to do this review section. So this is the last, there's 4 subsections in the background: description of the intervention, description of the population, how the intervention might work, and why it's important to do this review. And this section, people often just will throw in a very brief, it's important to do this review because it's an important review question, full stop, or because there's lots of evidence in this area and we don't know what the real answer is. But it needs to be more than just why this review is feasible. It has to be why this review is important. So for example, I'm going to be using actual real life examples throughout this presentation. And I should just clarify, these examples come from a review that I was an author on. So a lot of the mistakes I'm about to outline are mistakes that I have made. And that's just to, I just want to emphasize the point that these mistakes are easy to make. We all make them. But the most important thing is recognizing them, correcting them, and then moving forward. So in this review, you can see we talked about why it's important to do this review. We described that in the past, there have been some reviews already conducted in this area, but they're mainly from 2009, so they were quite out of date. And since then, we're aware of a number of new RCTs that have been completed and published in the area, and therefore a more up-to-date review is actually quite feasible. So this is good in a way. Some good practice things we're seeing in this section is, the authors clearly conducted a scoping review first to establish whether this is going to be a feasible review to conduct and whether it's actually going to create a meaningful result. The problem is it's only saying that a review would be feasible, but it's not saying a review is justified. We still don't know, is this actually an important review question that needs answered? Or is it just a review question that can be answered? So once this was explained to us by the editors, we then amended this section to include this additional piece of information at the end, where we justified not only why this review can be done, but why it should be done. So we explained this is an important research question to answer because the population that we were interested in, people with learning disabilities, are often on a large amount of different types of medication. And a lot of these medications have limited evidence about effectiveness and harmful side effects. And so we need to answer questions about these medications to make sure that this population is not taking an unnecessarily large amount of ineffective or harmful medication. So after the background, then we move on to the objectives. Now, the Cochrane Handbook does make this very easy for us because it even gives us a template sentence structure to use. So ideally, your objectives should simply read to assess the effects of whatever your intervention is for whatever the health problem is for or in whatever your population of interest is. So that should be simple enough to do. But the tricky part that people often come across is making sure that the objectives they write are actually clear and consistent with the PICO that they then go on to outline. So for example, in the same review I just mentioned, our original objective just read to assess the effectiveness of anti-dementia pharmacological interventions for treating cognitive decline in people with Down syndrome. So it fits the structure, which is good. It's nice and specific. So all looks good so far. But then when you move further through the protocol to the types of intervention section, you'll see that actually the type of intervention is a little bit more than what's being described in this objective. The type of intervention that we were interested in is any anti-dementia pharmacological intervention or any nutritional supplement. And when you look back at the objective, the fact that nutritional supplements are of interest in this review is not clearly reflected in this objective. So to make sure that the objective and the PICO is consistent, the objective then must be amended to read effectiveness of anti-dementia pharmacological interventions and nutritional supplements for treating cognitive decline in people with Down syndrome. So it's worth constantly checking back and forth across all the different sections of the review, making sure that anything you put in one section is clearly consistent with every other section that comes before and after it. So once we've got the background and the objectives set out, the next thing to do is set out the eligibility criteria. And again, this is a really important section and a very difficult one to get right. It's really important to be very specific and unambiguous in this section. I've seen a lot of authors in the past make the mistake of keeping this section quite vague because they're already not sure what they're going to find and they want to keep their options open about the different types of interventions they might come across. and they want to keep it themselves flexible so they can include anything they find that's actually interesting that they hadn't thought about in advance. This is not the ideal way to do this, because then the decisions you're making become very biased and subjective and very hard to replicate in future versions of the review. So to make life easier for yourself in the long run, it is really worth it to just spend a little bit extra time on this section. Make sure you have spelt out in really minute detail exactly what it is you're looking for and what it is you're not looking for. It may feel pedantic and irritating now, but it is worth it in the long run, I promise you. So, for example, in this section, I mean, there's some good things here in types of studies. It's clearly specifying that it's only RCTs that are eligible for inclusion. And it's also being very clear about what the comparator of interest is. We're looking at studies that compare the intervention to another type of pharmacological or nutritional supplement intervention, or with placebo, or with no treatment. And this is important to define because people are often very good at defining their interventions, but they forget to define their eligible comparators. So from this, it's now very clear that, okay, if it's a pharmacological intervention versus placebo, it's in. If it's pharmacological intervention versus another pharmacological intervention, it's in. But if it's, for example, pharmacological intervention versus psychosocial intervention, it would not be eligible, because that is not, psychosocial intervention is not one of the listed comparators of interest. So again, it's good to think about these things in ahead and make sure that you're ready and you know exactly what you're looking for. And types of participants, we see here, again, there's a good level of detail. You want to specify exactly the population you're interested in, including in terms of age and diagnosis. So here, it's very clear that they're interested in adults. And by adults, we mean aged 18 and older with Down syndrome. And there's even further detail here, which is good to see, where we actually say if we come across studies that include participants younger than 18 years of age, or participants who do not have Down syndrome, but perhaps have another type of learning disability, we will contact the study authors to request the subgroup data for participants specifically with Down syndrome aged 18 years and older. And this is an important caveat to put in, because it's quite common when you're looking for participants that you'll find studies that include a wider range of participants than what you're interested in. So, for example, it's in this review we found studies that included participants aged from 12 to 20, or participants with a range of learning disabilities, some of which included Down syndrome. And we needed to identify in advance what would we do with those studies. We don't want to just completely disregard them because they don't fit our exact criteria, because that is a lot of relevant and useful information that is being discarded. But we also can't include everything. So what we needed to do here was really specify, first of all, that we would reach out and try and get this data. But even that's not enough, because this says what we'll do, we'll ask for the data, but it doesn't explain what we'll do if we can't get the data. Again, a very common scenario is that you will reach out to authors, ask for extra data, and they will either reply saying, I'm sorry, but it's not possible, or they just won't reply at all. And then you still have to make the same decision. Okay, what do I do with this review? It's potentially relevant information, but I cannot access the information I need. And similarly, types of interventions, we need to be very clear here about every aspect of the intervention. So this is a good description in that it lists out all the different types of interventions that are eligible, the different types of pharmacological and nutritional supplements. But what it doesn't do is outline if there's any restrictions on things like delivery. Are we accepting any type of delivery, oral delivery as well as intravenous? Are we accepting any dose? A small dose is going to have a very different effect to a large dose. Similarly, short duration will have different effects to long durations. Low intensity will be very different to high intensity. It's very unclear from this criteria if we're accepting everything or if we're going to restrict to oral delivery only or high doses only, and so forth. So really, this is what this section needed to look like. The types of studies section was fine, but the types of participant section, we needed to add in this extra level of detail explaining that If we were unable to get the data that we needed, then we would include the study in the review, but we would exclude it from the meta-analysis. So that way we're still, we're acknowledging that this is a potentially relevant study, but we're not putting the data in with the rest of the data because it would just be too different to the rest of the data. But at least this way it's not being disregarded completely. And similarly, in the types of intervention section, we've now clarified that actually we're interested in the intervention of any type of delivery, dose, duration, or intensity. We're interested in it all. And the final part of the eligibility criteria section is the types of outcomes that we're interested in. Now, this section does cause confusion, I think probably because it comes under the section criteria for considering studies for inclusion in the review. So people tend to misunderstand this and think that you only include studies if they report the outcomes that you're interested in. And that's not always the case. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but just in terms of deciding which outcomes you want to focus on, there's a few key sort of good practice points that we really encourage. First of all, keep the number of outcomes to a minimum. People are often really tempted to list 10, maybe 20 outcomes because they know, oh, this is interesting. Oh, but that's also interesting. Oh, but I know I can get data on that. That is not how we make decisions about which outcomes to include in a review. You're not trying to gather information about every possible outcome. You have to think really carefully about which outcomes are actually important for clinical decision makers, which are the ones that are going to tell us the answer that we need to know. And we need to keep it restricted and focused on those short number of outcomes. And it's important that the outcomes should be a mixture of benefit and harm. So we don't want just outcomes of benefits or just outcomes of the possible side effects. We need to know both. We need to know what the effects that we hope it has, but we also need to know any potential side effects that we need to be wary of. And like I said, it should be outcomes that are not just interesting to you as a review author, but are relevant to the stakeholders. So think about this intervention from a consumer perspective, from a health perspective, from a policymaker perspective. What are these key stakeholders? What are they going to want to know? What questions do they have? And what outcome can you include that will answer that question for them? It's also really important to make sure that you're defining the outcomes in terms of the eligible measurement tools and also what timing you're interested in. Because again, even if you say, I'm interested in outcome depression, you'll gather all your studies and you'll find that every study measures depression using a different scale, or every study measures depression, some at short term, some at medium term, some at long term. And again, if you don't think beforehand what you want to do with this information, you're going to find yourself really struggling to make an unbiased and appropriate decision. So you need to decide beforehand, which outcome measures do I consider to be appropriate, in terms of their psychometric properties, which outcome measures would I have the most faith in, and also what follow-up time points is going to give me the answer I need. It might be I need a long-term follow-up because I know this intervention takes a while, or I need a short-term follow-up because I know that we need to know the answers as quickly as possible after the intervention is administered. And you also need to think at this stage what you will do if the same study measures one outcome but in multiple different ways. So, for example, if a study measures quality of life, they might measure it as a continuous outcome in terms of their score on a quality of life scale, and that will be reported as a continuous mean and standard deviation. But within the same study, they might also decide to report quality of life as a dichotomous outcome, as a quality of life improved or did not improve. And then that could be reported as a risk ratio or an odds ratio. You as an author have to decide beforehand, if you're given two options like that, how would you prioritize? Would you want to gather information from both those types? Or would you maybe say, no, I'm more interested in the continuous, not the dichotomous. So if I'm given the option of both, I'm going to prioritize extracting the continuous data rather than the dichotomous data. So again, it's these decisions that you don't think about, but then when you're faced with during the review process, this is what causes all these extra delays because you have to stop think about this and discuss with your review authors and argue about the best route. Whereas if you decide to make these decisions now at the protocol stage, it just makes the review process much smoother and much less stressful. So in our example, we have here the list of primary and secondary outcomes that we were interested in. So on the one hand, it's good, the outcomes are kept to a minimum. There's only 6 in total. And, you know, they're clearly outcomes that would be relevant to key stakeholders. And they're also balanced. We have improvement outcomes, but we also have adverse effect outcomes. But what we don't have here is how are the outcomes defined or measured? What would we consider to be appropriate ways of measuring these outcomes? And what would we consider to be inappropriate? And what we're also lacking is what are the follow-up time points of interest? So again, this is what this section should look like. It should be each of the outcomes alongside the appropriate measurement tools. And at the bottom, specifying that we're interested in follow-up periods of less than 3 months, 3 to 12 months, and over 1 year. Oh, and finally, yes, outcomes as eligibility criteria. So in most reviews, you will include studies based on the types of study design, participants, intervention, and comparison, but you will not include or exclude based on what outcomes they report. People do sort of confuse this and think that if a study doesn't report any of their outcomes of interest, they can automatically exclude it. But that's actually that's a dangerous thing to do, because if this study is focusing on the population that you're interested in and the intervention and comparison that you're interested in, but they haven't reported any data about this outcome that you have already said, this is a really important outcome, then that's a big red flag. That suggests that maybe these study authors, you know, most likely maybe they did collect data in this outcome, but they didn't like the results. And so they're just keeping it out of the final results. Or if they didn't even plan to collect data on this result, on this outcome, that, you know, is this, what were they thinking? You know, this is, if it's such an important outcome, why is it missing? So it is important to still include these studies. They probably won't be part of the meta-analysis, but they can be included in the review, listed as included studies, and their potential selective outcome reporting bias can then be discussed and elaborated on further as part of the risk of bias assessment. So people often make mistakes thinking that they can exclude studies based on the outcomes, and they try to justify it in these ways. They might say things like, well, this is a really large evidence base. We cannot possibly include everything. So this will help us focus and reduce the number of studies included in the full review. But like I say, this is not an appropriate way to do this, because then you're discarding all these possibly eligible studies that could have relevant information. It's just not immediately obvious or accessible. Or another option that people often do is they say only high quality studies are likely to assess the outcomes that we're interested in. So by only including studies that report our outcomes of interest, this will ensure we're only including high quality studies. So this, I mean, it's an interesting idea that only high quality studies will assess the right outcomes, but this is why we have the risk of bias assessment. You know, so this is why we include all of the eligible studies, and then we use the risk of bias assessments to really determine what their quality is like, what their risk of bias is like. And then if it is a study that's is at risk of selective outcome reporting bias, then this is an important finding to reflect in the review. But some more appropriate reasons why you might exclude based on outcomes is if it's an intervention that could be studied in the same population but for different purposes. So for example, Botox is a really interesting intervention because most people associate Botox with as an intervention to treat facial wrinkles. But there's actually some emerging evidence that Botox might also be useful in people with Parkinson's disease. So if you're looking at for, you know, adult participants who are receiving Botox as an intervention, you're going to receive a lot of studies on both of those topics. And the best way to, you know, focus in on the topic that you're interested in is to see, okay, have they reported on facial wrinkles? Then it's definitely in column A. Have they reported on Parkinson's symptoms? Then it's in column B. So that's an example where it might be appropriate to exclude based on outcome. Or it might be some reviews, rather than focusing on the effectiveness of an intervention for a condition, they're focusing on the adverse effects of an intervention for multiple different conditions, like aspirin. And in which case, aspirin can be used in a range of different conditions. But if the main focus of the review is to assess the adverse effects of the intervention, then it's entirely reasonable to only include studies if they report on adverse effects. So I'll stop there again, just in case there are any questions or if anyone has any issues that they need clarified.
Yes, no, we have actually a number of questions. So let's take a couple of them at this point, and then move on, as we have quite a lot to cover yet.
Yeah. Okay.
So quickly, is there a word limit guide for the background session?
I don't think so, but I would still recommend keeping it as succinct as possible. Like, you don't want to spend all of your, like, you don't want to have pages and pages of background section, but just keep it succinct. But I don't think there is a formal word limit.
Okay. Someone asked about, don't we need to specify specific objectives at this stage? So is there specific objectives as opposed to general? Or
yes, no, I mean, keep your subjective specific as possible, and it often is, it's more than one objective, but yes, no, absolutely, it should be specific.
Another question, was the best time to do a systematic review if other systematic reviews have been done in this topic, in this specific topic?
I suppose the question is then, what is your systematic review going to add that the other systematic reviews haven't done? I mean, if you're going to include a slightly different PICO, or if you're going to use slightly more rigorous methods, but if your review isn't going to do anything different, then it doesn't really seem worth it. I would wait a few months for new research to become available to then you can get a more up-to-date answer.
Okay. Is randomization always kept when we ask a subset of data from a study? Will the two groups be comparable to be included in a systematic review of RCTs?
Nope, you're absolutely right. That will sort of break the randomization, and that is then something that you would, that's a decision you make, that is something that you will first of all have to explore later on as a sensitivity analysis, and absolutely acknowledge and discuss in the discussion section under potential biases in the review process.
Thanks. And then two questions on summary of findings table. Does this recommended limit of outcomes change in the summary of findings table?
I will cover summary of findings tables more later on in the presentation, but the recommendation is still 7 outcomes maximum in the summary of findings table.
To be included, should studies at least have measured the outcomes of interest, even though no results is reported?
Again, it will depend on your research question, and also what, if they haven't reported the data, why haven't they? You know, is it just that it isn't reported in the publication, but it might actually be available if you reached out and asked the authors? Or is it that it just wasn't an area of focus to them? So I'm afraid that's not an easy question to give a straight answer to. It depends on the research question and that you have.